Welcome, folks, to the first Fall 2022 session of the Black Beyond Data Reading Group. We gather here the last Friday of the month, except where that's not the case. As you can see, we have our amazing speakers lined up for the year. If you need to register, bit.ly/BBD Reads is where you can find the registration page to stay up on all of the next set of readings and all of the materials that are rolling in and out. Black Beyond Data Reading Group is a project of Black Beyond Data, which is co-PI by myself, Kim Gallen, and Alexander White. Black Beyond Data Reading Group is organized by Lauren Rubin at St. Francis Neighborhood Center, Kim Gallen, myself, with an assist, a very necessary and important assist from Skylar Haynes, who is the one who's been emailing you guys of late. We have our next set of readings in October. We will be joined by Brandeis Marshall, and that will be October 28th. Same thing, 12 noon. This session here, we have been joined by Dr. Catherine Knight-Steele. And this session is co-sponsored by the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, the Community Knowledge Lab of the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, as well as the DISCO Network, Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism. Catherine Knight-Steele is an associate professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. There she directs the Black Communication and Technology Lab, BCaT, as part of the DISCO Network. Dr. Knight-Steele's research focuses on race, gender, and media with an emphasis on Black culture and discourse and digital communication. She examines representations of marginalized communities in the media and how groups resist oppression and practice joy. She is the author of the amazing text, Digital Black Feminism, published by NYU Press. And Digital Black Feminism is an incredibly powerful book that explores the ways that Black women have been at and are at the forefront of some of the century's most important discussions about technology: trolling, online harassment, algorithm bias, influencer culture, and yet are not necessarily considered in those conversations. Where they are not, the Dr. Knight-Steele brings them into the conversation and brings them in on Black women's, Black feminists' own terms. This is a beautiful book. It is a book in which those who've been doing this work for some time absolutely felt seen. I absolutely felt seen. So thank you, Catherine, for this work. It is so important. We have some of that as our reading for today. We also have another piece by her, but I'm going to cede the stage to Dr. Knight-Steele and give her the spotlight so that she can do her magic, and then we will open it up for our conversation. This should be a very free-flowing conversation. People feel free to jump in and feel free to use the chat. And yeah, Dr. Knight-Steele, you're up.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here. It's always lovely to be in spaces where folks are ready to chat and have done some reading and have questions. And so I am so looking forward to that. I'm going to talk for a little while, but I'm going to try to keep it shorter so that we can save as much time as possible for the actual dialogue and the conversation. But I always have to start in the same way that I do every time, which is by thanking the wonderful folks who invited me to this space. I don't take it for granted. I appreciate you. I thank you for your work. I thank you for the work that is seen and unseen, and for the folks whose labor I don't get to witness, but who I get to benefit from in these spaces. I'm so grateful for the folks who make it possible for us to do this work, whose work is often not recognized by our universities and other organizations, who we need to be in solidarity with when it comes time to renew contracts and negotiate on their behalves, whose labor is often precarious. Those are the folks that I thank the most at these junctures at the starts of my talk, because I had the privilege and benefit in doing this work of thinking a lot about that unseen labor, a lot about the way that folks do work behind the scenes that doesn't get charted, that doesn't get documented, but whose artifacts we make use of every day, who the product of their work becomes the center point of our lives, even when we don't remember their names. And so I challenge us all to be in conversation with those folks and to remember and to think through how our work becomes possible because of theirs. So this book, I think one of the delights, I guess, about writing it, and it's big surprises for me, are the ways that I got to write a very different book than I had planned on writing at the start. I think if I had written this book 5 years beforehand, which probably would have been the good course of action career-wise, then it would have been a different book that I wouldn't have liked as much, frankly, because in writing this one, I got to think a lot about history. Working with AdHume, as Jessica pointed out, put me in touch with a lot of wonderful, brilliant historians, archivists, folks who pushed me in my thinking beyond what I had been challenged to do previously in thinking about digital culture and online life. And so the delight of this book, I think, was to get to move through histories, through present moments, and then think about the future. And so I'm going to try to move through that a little bit quickly and talk through that as I think through some of the pieces of this book and what I hope that we get to have a generative conversation today. I ask you to ruminate on the question, when I say the word technology, what comes to mind for you? And think for a moment about where that definition first started. Did it start in a history or a book in school where you provided that definition by watching the news? Did you hear stories and anecdotes about folks like Bill Gates who were building their technology empires in their basements or garages? How did we come to understand what technological expertise was and who gets to be the expert in those situations? I ask that question because the answer for most of us is not that we started to learn about the history of the relationship of Black women in technology. I will say for myself that the way technology was first described to me and I first began to understand it was very divorced from the history of Black women's relationship to labor and technology in this country. And it wasn't until we start to peel back the layers that we begin to understand that it is not just accident or coincidence that Black women are erased from that history, that it is an actual intentional project of our country to divorce the relationship of technology from Black women and Black women's work. I was talking to a graduate student a few months ago, and they said, you do a lot of operationalizing of terms in this book. And I said, well, I have to thank Dr. Angie Rajecki at the University of Illinois, Chicago, because in my first year of my graduate program, that's all we did. I feel like every class session was us operationalizing a term. Oh, you can't use that word until you tell me the history of it. You can't use that concept until you tell me everybody who's written something about it before. And so I think it's worked its way into the way I think and the way that I write. And that's what happened with me in this term technology. I wanted to spend some time thinking about how we developed this understanding. And I was fortunate when I came to University of Maryland to work with Dr. Patricia Hill Collins for the first couple of years before she retired. And there's this quote that she has that really stuck with me. And she said, the shadow obscuring a complex Black woman's intellectual tradition is neither accidental nor benign. I take the first few chapters of this text, I think, in a way that probably would be disappointing to technologists that pick up the book. I don't talk about social media or TikTok or blogging for a while. I spend the first few chapters of this book digging into the history and thinking about how exactly it is that we got in this short 300-year history of the United States to a master narrative that's about American efficiency and progress and democracy, where marginalized populations are intentionally removed, where our lives and our experiences are not a part of the written record. Lots of scholars like Tanya Sutherland have written about something called archival amnesty and the ways that we have been intentionally pulled out of the archive and the kind of violence that this does to our histories and to our personage. So I set out in this early part of the text to try to locate spaces in the US where Black women were actually the purveyors of technology without the watchful eye of the dominant group, where technologies were used almost exclusively on and by and for Black women, where Black women were sought after and respected for their expertise. And I landed on a space that maybe wasn't the most obvious to a lot of folks, but maybe it is to those of us who spend some of our time on the weekend getting our hair retwisted or pressed or getting our extensions put in. And that's where I find myself in the beauty shop. I begin with this space because I think it's the only way for us to recognize Black women's expertise is to centralize Black women's expertise, to find spaces where it is unquestioned, where it is unchallenged, so that we can then begin to see it in other spaces. We begin to erase the problematic framework and lenses that we've all been given in order to see our history and instead begin to see the truth of these spaces. So I built the analytic of the beauty shop as a way for us to understand the layered complexity of what I call Black feminist technoculture. Now, Brock labels cyberculture as a digital practice and artifacts informed by a Black aesthetic. He differentiates a Black cyberculture from a technoculture and defines the latter as a combination of whiteness and modern technological beliefs. Instead, he argues that Black cyberculture arises from what he calls the aesthetic and the libidinal. So Black cyberculture reflects Black folks' ability to interject pleasure and joy into technology from a Black experience that very often in our literature is relegated to spaces of pain and deprivation. I like Brock's critical interjection here because it asks us to consider how Black folks' unique experiences get transposed into their relationship with technology. This work, I think, provides us a valuable starting point because it separates Black cultural production from white cyberculture. So what I try to do in Digital Black Feminism is build upon this logic. Black women's unique experience with oppression and with resistance shapes our ability to understand communication technologies, both analog and digital. So if white cyber or white technoculture is built on white ideology, on patriarchy, on misogyny, then Black feminist technoculture is in fact its undoing. It requires us to centralize Black women in our conversation about technology, not to put Black women on the periphery where we're comparing Black women to whiteness or to Black men's cyberculture, erasing these boxes of patriarchy and white supremacy that constrict our potential. So within this idea of the beauty shop, I kind of focus on this analytic as a historical lens through which to see our consistent and persistent relationship with technology for three reasons. The first reason is that it helps us recenter. It reminds us that Black feminism is not responsive to white feminism, that it predates white feminism. Toni Morrison writes that having nothing to fall back on, not maleness, not whiteness, not ladyhood, not anything, that out of a profound desolation of her reality, she may well have invented herself while talking about Black women. So unlike white women suffragists who were fighting to prove their strength and their viability in a world of men, Black women had done that, proven strength and vitality, proven both psychological and physical strength, had undergone a baptism of fire and had emerged intact. The beauty shop allows us to relocate Black feminism at the center point of fighting back against patriarchy, not as a periphery, not as an afterthought, not as something that comes in a second or a third wave. Rather, we locate it in the work of Black women suffragists. We locate it in the work of Black enslaved women on our shores who are fighting simultaneously white slaveholders and caring and attending to families and inserting agency in their own homes. We locate it in the work, like Brittany Cooper reminds us, of race women of the 20th century who are crafting these brilliant rhetorical campaigns that centralize their own freedom. And that freedom wasn't rooted in a desire to take power from white women or to take power from Black women, but was the aim of Black women's feminism from the early colonial period till now is the same. It's revolutionary, emancipatory freedom from the confines of all hegemonic power divides. So this is the first reason that I choose the beauty shop. I think it gives us the lens to say, let's look at a space where Black women are at the center. The next reason I choose the beauty shop as this analytical tool is that it relocates our ideas toward the actual act or the praxis of doing something, of doing hair. So I look at Black hair care as an example of a technology that belongs to Black women. Now, we all have seen stages of appropriation and stealing of Black culture, right, as it relates to various Black women's hairstyles, but it's impossible to look at the creativity and the technological expertise of Black women in their hair care without actually focusing on the extent to which these praxis, these products that end up coming out of them belong to Blackness and belong to Black women. Andrea Rose Clark explains braiding as technology with a rule structure like an algorithm. I tell my students, put this many words on, but when your words are this good, sometimes folks need to read it. And what Clark says here is design and fabrication tools perform aesthetic gestures based preset commands and algorithms. The execution and repetition of a series of procedures produces the patterns that we see as braids. It's this closed system of rules that allows for variable patterns to evolve in a manner akin to the precision laser cutter burning and etching image onto the material braiders map and part the hair in preparation for a series of cornrows. Clark is telling us that it is not just the end product that we should pay attention to, but the procedure, the praxis of doing the hair, and what it says about the relationship between the braider and the braidee, what it says about the kind of intuitive and also skillful activities that have to happen, the technological skill that must be developed over time and passed on. Natrice Gaskins builds upon this and says that certain patterns are amenable or open to algorithmic modeling, but amenable need not connote the simple. A square is easier to simulate and repeat, but the process of braiding, knitting, weaving these shapes into design is about the complexity that arises from simplicity. Just because it looks easy, just because we make it look easy, doesn't mean that it is. What these two women's quotes remind us of is that if we turn to the beauty shop, we can actually locate spaces where technologies were designed and developed by Black women and for Black women, that these technologies point us towards skill and expertise that's developed generationally, that's passed down, and that's required in order for Black women to preserve a sense of self-agency and personhood. This lends us to looking at online spaces that recreate the same sensibility around technology, of passing down of ideas and technologies over time. The next reason I turn our attention to the beauty shop is because of the fact of the entrepreneurship of Black women that exists in this space. The beauty shop is a site of Black women's entrepreneurial skill. Businesses that were built without loans, without access to resources, that were built in homes, in coffee, in kitchen tables, in the basement corner sinks, that were passed on in churches and in social circles where people learned marketing and expertise without any training at a business school or from any formal entity, by Black women and for Black women. Black women pairing the idea of making money with serving a community need. Black women doing work that wasn't useful to anybody else but Black women for the sake of Black women. And we see again that same level of entrepreneurship passed into our digital spaces, where Black women are some of the earliest purveyors of blogging technology, understanding how to operate their own sites, how to use aesthetic appeal to draw in people, how to use high context environments to wield conversation and discursive patterns in ways that intentionally segregates and creates enclave spaces for their ability to be in dialogue with each other. So the enclave then becomes the fourth reason why this beauty shop serves as an analytic tool that draws us from the analog to the digital. Because the enclave, as Catherine Squires points out, talks about how there's not always a purpose behind groups gathering to talk back to the dominant group. You know, if we think about folks like Habermas and even Nancy Fraser, what they're arguing is that, yeah, sometimes folks aren't a part of the public sphere, but they're always trying to be a part of it. They're always trying to be in dialogue with it. And Catherine Squires reminds us brilliantly that that's not what's going on here, that Black folks have very brilliantly hidden discourse from the dominant group in spaces like a beauty shop, right? Where there's a high context for participation, where there are internal ways of knowing, validations of our emotions, accountability, narrative prioritized over debate. This becomes a really intentional space that's crafted both offline, and then we can trace that to the online spaces that replicate these kinds of discursive practices. And we can see over time how that happens. So I take this metaphor, and I use metaphors a lot, I blame and also thank my dearly departed dad who brought me up in Black church, right? That we got to have a metaphor that ties this together for us, right? And so the beauty shop did that for me. But then I had to think, well, how do I make this theoretical? Because, you know, I got to get tenure from this book. It can't just be my thoughts on life. And so how do we take this idea of a beauty shop and infuse Black feminist theory into this? And we find the spaces where Black women have already been telling us about ourselves, and we just haven't written it down quite yet, right? So I put together three Black women's theories that I think help together draw us to the actual theory of Black feminist technoculture. The first is Pat Hill Collins and the Matrix of Domination. I feel like I probably don't have to explain to this particular group what the Matrix of Domination is, but I'll just quickly say intersectionality is the buzzword of the day, right? And intersectionality allows us to do a lot of really important work. But what has also happened to intersectionality is that folks have very brilliantly taken that word and used it to mean a plethora of things that were never the original intention. And they have created such disarray around that word, that sometimes we find ourselves in a troubled situation where people are using the term intersectionality to mean something that it was never intended to mean. Intersectionality is not an add-on to any kind of thing you already have access to. This is an intersectional phone. This is an intersectional t-shirt. I'm an intersectional woman. No, that's not it. That's not what was meant, right? And so while it's a fantastic term, a lot of damage has been done recently in the public sphere around this term. And so I always harken back to Pat Hill Collins's Matrix of Domination, because it's really hard. It's really hard to take matrix of domination and make it mean something else. If you're going to use the term matrix of domination, you're going to talk about the domination piece, right? And so what Pat Hill Collins gives us in this idea, in this metaphor of a matrix also, is how we understand a system with interconnected parts that are all working together, complex layered pieces that surround these systems that surround the lives of Black women. Matrices containing parts that sometimes aren't always immediately visible to the outside. Matrices containing parts that only carry the meaning when they're layered into each other, but matrices also giving us the power to see the cracks in a system through which we can actually take up resistant strategies against us. It provides us a foundation to study digital culture, which also brilliantly hides its oppressive forces. Joan Morgan's hip hop feminism, I think it's not too much to say, saved my life. I read this in undergrad and it changed my entire perspective on what it meant to be a feminist, on how to take that word and own that word and not need any other words to do work that Black women had already been doing with that word. She brought forward hip hop feminism at a time to explain what was happening to Black feminism in the state of hip hop, how we could love hip hop, be shaped by it, while vociferously pushing back against the misogynoir that's embedded at much of its core. Hip hop feminism, I think, gave us a roadmap to think about digital space, to think about the ways that our lives could be connected to writing online, pop culture online, how we first read about Black feminism online, but online is also the place that we experience the harassment and the violence and the appropriation. So digital culture, just like hip hop, can simultaneously hold the harms and the victories, right? The possibilities for entrepreneurship and the ways that folks steal our stuff. So being a Black feminist online necessitates what Joan Morgan calls fucking with the grays. This stuff is complicated. It's not going to be one or the other. And the last part here is from Anna Everett, and it's Black technophilia. Black technophilia, she writes about this in 2009. This is way ahead of our time, right? In 2009, people are still only writing about Black folks online as being a part of the digital divide. In 2009, folks are not seeing the brilliance of Black folks online. They are seeing Black folks as deviant and deficient in their use of technology. And Anna Everett gives us Black technophilia to combat that. She says, while everyone else is calling Black folks technophobic, actually we're technophilic, right? Since then, we've seen Brock call this a natural affinity. We've seen Ray Fouché give name to this as Black vernacular technological creativity. We've seen folks name this again and again. What I try to do here is make us remember that Black women aren't purely magical. We are skillful, we have expertise, and it is a long fought battle to have those items, and they should be recognized as such. So together, these concepts lay this groundwork for the principles, the praxis, the product that I go into in the book. And I kind of summarize that at the end of the introduction that y'all read for today. This whole section here is about the past. It's about looking back at what Black women have done in order to understand a present. So I'll take just a minute or two to talk about the present, because I told you my dad was a pastor and I've got to have three things. And so it's a past, a present, and a future. And so we're going to move into the present right now. And in the present, I want to talk about how we do the work, how Black women do digital Black feminism, and how we as readers, consumers, scholars interact with that work. How do we move between thinking about the work that Black women do online as for a public and personal? How do we as scholars marry different kinds of research that's necessary to study Black women in these spaces? How does our archival work marry with online data collection? How do we apply similar strategies to texts and data in the form of a correspondence that's written in 1898 that we do to a tweet that's written in 2018? Because any strategy for studying Black feminist technoculture has to situate the text historically, contextually. It has to be focused on the people rather than just the tools. And it has to ask us to think about the relationship that Black women are forming with their tools. So we have to think about how these artifacts that are left behind by Black women, both online and offline, belong to lots of different genres at the same time. And the problem that we tend to run into is when we try to pigeonhole what folks are doing in these spaces into one genre and use the one method we've been trained to do to study it. But we know from our own personal experience that people are simultaneously producing, let's use Twitter as an example, tweets for mass consumption. I want this to go viral, right? But they're also using that very same channel to direct specific messages to specific people via direct message they know in quote real life. And Kim, I'm counting you in the mix. I know you in real life now, right? They're also engaging in forms of public address, right? That I am giving a proclamation. But at the same time, they use places like Twitter to fashion their own archive. Every time I hashtag digital Black feminism, it's so I can pull that back up, not so everybody else can. But how do we have one tool that allows for the study of text and communication that has so many different objectives? How do we combine traditional discursive analysis with platform studies and affordance studies and critical cultural work and ethnographic work and participatory observation? I think Brock's critical technocultural discourse analysis goes a long way in helping us think about this. For those who haven't heard of this before, Andre Brock develops this way of analyzing digital culture in order to simultaneously think about interrogating the culture and the technology as intertwined concepts. You can't separate them, and I'm only going to study the technological components, or I'm only going to study what people are saying in the blogosphere. Brock reminds us that these things are happening in conjunction for the user, so they have to happen in conjunction for the researcher. So in order to do this as a Black feminist, in order to study Black feminist technoculture, I said that we have to form a relationship with the study of capture. I think that ultimately studying Black women's work online is about studying capture. And I'll start with history to give us an example. In her book, Barracoon, Zora Neale Hurston interviews Cudjo Lewis, who was one of the last survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. And in the 1927 interview, he details his capture and his life in the US that follows. But raised in Eatonville, Florida, Hurston also travels back to her hometown across the South to capture Black life in the early part of the 20th century. Her autobiography captures pieces of herself. You see, this word capture keeps coming up because it's always indicative in some way of power. Who is in a position to capture? Who do they choose to capture? What becomes of the capture and the capturer? That matrix of domination, again, reminds us of the dominant group's longstanding prerogative to control the capture and distribution of Black life and Black women's images. But still, this activity of capture, of curating, of making your own life available in words and images online shows just how complex the relationship is that Black feminists have with the activity of capture as praxis. So I ask, what's our responsibility in relationship with capture as people who are either researchers in this space or consumers of this work? Does our work capture the moments, the histories of the people that we study? Are we trained to understand the platforms that we're looking at as extending the possibilities both of distributing our own power or enlivening the power of the folks whose words we are capturing in that moment? We understand intuitively that when Anna Julia Cooper picks up a pen to write, that her letters to her friends are different than the ones they are to her alma mater. We can see that, we can study that. Are we bringing that same attention to platforms like Instagram? Are we giving the same space for folks on Instagram to capture their lives in different ways at different moments? Or are we studying them as all doing the same kinds of things? If they made that tweet public, it must be for everyone. Well, we know that's not true. Sometimes I tweet late at night about Real Housewives, and I hope that my colleagues are not awake. And so we understand that capture works differently. On the screen, I have 3 moments of capture from blogger Luvia J, who captures her wedding in 3 very different ways across 3 very different platforms. How do I know that she does that? Not because I used some processing tool to scrape and capture as much data as possible, but because I was present when she captured it for herself. Because I decided that to be there was to understand in context what folks were doing and why they were doing it. Field work, sitting in the barber like Melissa Harris Perry did in her book, asking the questions, trying to trace a lineage, requires a little bit more of us sometimes. It requires a little bit more of our attention to treat the social media posts and technologies of right now in the ways that I treat the memoirs and letters and diaries that Black women left for us some 100 years ago. Both require an ethic of care for the text, the people who create them and the people that read them. For every blog I studied, I was there when the posts first happened. I read them that day, or I saw them later in the week. I watched the comments as they came in. I knew when tweets got deleted, or when folks tweeted about something without a hashtag that was meant to capture something that was going on that moment, that day. There'd be no way 10 days later when I scraped that tweet that I would know what in the world that person was talking about if I hadn't seen a mutual friend of ours talk about something that morning and someone respond that evening without using a tweet thread. So I can't be there in that way for historical documents. I can't go back in time and watch Anna Julia Cooper write to Oberlin College, but I can treat her words like they require context. I can seek out that context. I can also lose myself so deeply in the pages and the letters of documents that I forget that I came there to ask a question at all. And I instead am responsible to getting to know the person that created those letters in that moment. All right, so we've talked about past, we've talked about present. Let's talk quickly about the future. For the future, I like to think about the lessons that studying Black feminist technoculture gives us about the possibilities and the constraints of our digital world. I'll introduce you to a text that I wrote about in the last chapter of this book, which is a viral video called Intersectionality Pizza. Anyone remember that? It came out in 2015. Akilah Hughes was the comedian who created this. And you've got to take yourself back to 2015, where folks weren't talking about intersectionality the way they were online right now. She creates this viral moment where she's describing different pizza toppings as stand-ins for different folks, right? So deluxe pizzas become Black women and cheese pizzas become white women. Stay with me. And she describes Black women's exclusion from mainstream feminist causes and the additional burdens that Black women face by adding on new pizza toppings, right? We're both pizzas, but we got different toppings. The viral video, it goes viral, right? Gets reposted on blogs, people are sharing it on cable news networks, and it really seems like Akilah Hughes is onto something. This short video gets packaged in a way that holds the attention of a public that we know is increasingly used to consuming short, digestible bits. She took material that's really challenging and she made it easy to understand. She did it without alienating any viewers because Americans love pizza, they love burgers, and pizza and burgers, unlike the people that Hughes was using to represent, don't hold any responsibility for their existence or how their existence impacts the other people's existence. So it was a nice video to consume. And when digital videos like this emerge that package complex theory into these bite-sized chunks that we think students might pay attention to, I think it's tempting to embrace their use. I like the video. I still do. I still think it's pretty funny because intersectionality pizza provides an attractive metaphor, especially for students. But what we also know to be true is that buzzwords and viral videos do not provide the tools for in-depth critical analysis. That as a medium of mass communication, digital platforms can package ideas for sale. But that commodification process comes at a cost. That commodification process provides us only superficial access to complex theory, culminating in a watered down product that's more palatable to a larger, broader audience. What's more, though, is that this process and this work of commodification of Black feminist concepts is a long historical process, and we know how it ends. It ends with the commodification of actual people, actual human beings. I trace this in the book in what I call the prototyping of digital Black feminism, and ask us to think about, even those of us who are Black women or those of us who follow Black feminist principles, the way that we engage in this prototyping and commodification process ourselves. It's this kind of process that leads us back to potentially unpaid work about the limitations that agency can have in digital Black feminism. And it's at this point that I often say, I hate to end the talk in this sad way because this book is in so many ways a celebration of the work that Black women do. But it also is a realistic, eyes wide open view of what happens if we're not careful about how we lend our ideas, our persons, our bodies to spaces that were crafted to be commodities, lest we become them ourselves. So I am really excited to talk to you about this book, about what you got from it, and hear from you as we go forward in the talk. I'm really, really grateful for hanging out with me and listening to me as I talk in my highly congested voice. Thanks so much.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Rounds of applause everywhere, emoji hands everywhere. Thank you so much. This is so rich, so rich. And I definitely see a lot of conversation in the chat with a lot of points that you are raising and have raised in the book and just in general. So we are going to open the floor for questions and conversation. This is a longer reading group than normal, so we have plenty of time. You can use the raise hand function if you want to. We'll also be watching the chat in case you want to throw questions in the chat. But yes, feel free to jump in as you wish. I'm going to start us off just to kind of warm things up. I've got a ton of questions. I'm not going to ask my really intense ones yet. I hope folks will jump in otherwise.
Warm me up.
But I do have, I actually thought you might start by talking a little bit about how you sort of enter into thinking about technology and Black women, Black feminism, not just Black women, but Black feminism in the moment that is now. And I guess I'm thinking about also how COVID has shifted folks' engagement and time online, just like having space and time to be online. I saw Tatiana put in the chat, TikTok is also one of those spaces that is like, yay, but also, ooh. And right. I don't know if you have any, any reflections on how these framings and how they've shifted maybe into this new normal and what we might be attentive to now.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my friends was joking with me a couple of weeks ago that I should get a tattoo, my next tattoo that says both and, because that's how I answer every question. But it's both and, it's both this and that. And so I'm going to do a both and answer to this question and frame it around TikTok. Maybe is that I think a lot of folks, I started on TikTok during the early part of the pandemic, right? At that time, it was just my teen nieces and nephews were using it. And I was like, that's for the kids. And then obviously now I spend 3 hours a day there. And so it's this place that's really interesting and ripe for study because I think it signals a bunch of different shifts all at the same time. And when I say it signals shift, it doesn't mean that TikTok is responsible for it. Nor is COVID responsible for it. But I think what both of those, that platform and that cultural moment, bring to light are some evolvements that we're making in terms of digital technology. One of those that I'm really fascinated with right now is about content creation. It's about the shift from being a user to being a creator, a content creator online. And I start to have this discussion in the book about Black feminists and their use of branding, right? And how we're figuring out how we all have to have this kind of public brand for ourselves, whether or not we're selling things online, right? So we're encouraging students in grad school to develop an online brand via their Twitter platform. We're encouraging folks to create their websites. We're encouraging folks to post in certain ways. And I notice it popping up in lots of different ways. My partner, we were out having dinner one day and he goes, no, I got to find the right sound to post with this picture. And I was like, who are you? When did this happen? You didn't even have an Instagram 2 years ago. This is weird, my guy. And, so it's infiltrated every corner and every aspect of our life. And so TikTok is this really interesting way that I think illuminates this, because TikTok is all about content creation, right? It is not about sociality in the way that we have as digital scholars talked about social media before. It's not about networking and connecting with other people. It is about consumable content. And it's about learning how to make your content most consumable, right? And so studying the work that Black folks and Black women and Black femmes and Black feminists have done and are doing on TikTok is really valuable, I think, because it's opening up possibilities for two avenues. One is the extensive kind of expertise that's been built in other spaces taking hold in this new TikTok space, and the pushback that Black women are having against platform affordances that limit their ability to create content and make money in that space, right? So that's an interesting avenue for research. I'm also really interested, though, in how people are effing with the grays on TikTok, right? So they're effing with this model that TikTok is all about consumable content, is all about commodification. Because I would argue that Black women who are fully aware that their stuff is going to be stolen, are fully aware that people are like there to appropriate, there to take, are still acting in the most joyful and pleasurable ways on this app, right? Are still dancing, are still singing, are still doing hair, are still doing things that are not actually purely about the money making aspect. So I hope people continue to study that part. It's really important. We can't discount it. But also what I'm interested in is the pleasure moments, is how we take these spaces that are meant to commodify us and we still act in ways that we find, that we seek out pleasure on, that we perform pleasure on. And so I think there are these two kind of pathways that both COVID and that TikTok give us the space to explore, is that we are not one dimensional and we have this multifaceted way of using digital technology, and we have to be open to how folks are telling us they're using it and how we're seeing that play out in front of us.
And we did get to the pleasure, Kim.
We got to the pleasure. Yes.
Yes, always. Like
Always.
That's Black womanhood. Always
It
give
is.
pleasure.
And ignoring the pleasure, you know, as a scholar, as a researcher, right? And it's not intentional, but it pains me almost to watch so many folks who are not interested in Black women's pleasure, are not interested in the fullness of Black women, right? Because I'm happy that there are folks who are able to study the hate and able to study the violence and able to study all of the harassment. Like, you got to study that. We have to make sure that that's known, but we also have to make sure that we understand that we're full human beings and that we don't exist purely as responsiveness to whiteness, right? Like, there is so much of Blackness and a Black culture that is not about white folks, that is not about white supremacy, that is not about patriarchy. It's not. It's about our pleasure. Right. And so Joan Morgan points us back to this really wonderfully. And I think Brock's work in a lot of ways, his focus on the libidinal, help us to think through what it means to focus our attention on the pleasure, even if only briefly, to make sure that we're getting a more full and robust accounting of what's going on.
I'll just jump in really quickly and take advantage of this really brief moment. Excuse me, to say that we're reading your book in my class on Black feminism. Black feminism, politics of pleasure and care. And the one thing we've been trying to work through is to think about models of pleasure and care within the context of Black feminism, but also to sort of sketch out. Patricia Hill Collins talks about that dialogic relationship between oppression and activism. And we're trying to think about what a dialogic relationship between oppression and pleasure looks like, right? And how they're mutually constitutive, and how the oppression of Black women generates a particularly unique and very specific type of pleasure, as you said, that can happen in the midst of commodification and co-opting the work and things of that nature. So just want to thank you again for this presentation and your book. And I might try to sneak in and see if I can get you to join our class virtually.
I would love it. I mean, so Hurston has this essay that she writes like 1932 called The Characteristics of Negro Expression, which, for whatever reason, I read this essay in undergrad and like it has never left my brain because it's so brilliantly written, right? It's this ethnographic piece. It's really, really smart. But also there's this one section of it where she talks about how Black folks, by nature of how we have had to endure within US society, have an absence of the concept of privacy. That's what she calls it, right? And what she's saying is you'll never get to be by yourself. And so what you learn to do in the midst of that is not to perform for the folks who are watching, but to be you in spite of who's watching, right? And like, that's the kind of pleasure that I think is missing from some of our conversations. Like, we as researchers sometimes are really interested in like the talk back. Like, we're interested in moments where like people are met with oppression and they do this thing to show everybody. And I'm like, that's not it. That's not the totality of it. Because so often what we're doing is, I know you're watching and I do not care. Like, you can watch if you want to, but this is not about you. And so I think that the moments that like I'm more interested in now are the moments that are happening sometimes in full view of. Sometimes they're not enclave moments, right? They're happening in full intentional view of others, but they're not also resistance, because I think that there's an important distinction, right? They're not moments of, I'm going to do this to prove my humanity. I'm going to do this to show you just how much I am this, that, or the other, right? I'm doing this because it brings me deep and intense pleasure, and that's sufficient. Those are the moments I'm really, really interested in thinking about and theorizing and looking at those spaces that are popping up online. I think TikTok gives us some of that. I think there are some moments there that are very much about the pleasure of the person making the video. And I think we should pay as much attention to those moments as we are the folks who are making videos to make the money, right? I also think that we don't have to we don't have to disentangle those concepts, right? That we can make money while things are pleasurable.
I love this song. It's my favorite song. We do have some questions, and folks may want to speak their question by voice. On the queue, we have Vincente. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for queuing me up. Thank you, Dr. Steele. I really appreciate your work. I'm working with it a lot as I'm trying to write my dissertation. I'm trying to think about digital feminism, digital Black feminism, and I'm trying to work with like rap and spoken word. And your text has been really interesting for me to try to figure out how Black women's thoughts about hip hop, how Black women push against hip hop, and the way that they circulate these thoughts on the internet. And so I'm just kind of wondering, as I'm doing this work and as I'm reading your work over and over again, how do you feel that your text, Black Digital Feminism, is helping us examine for the contemporary moment, like the rise in Black women rappers, their popularity, their visibility, and the continued existence of just rampant misogyny?
Yeah, good question. Good question. I mean, like, I think it's another one of those both and moments, right? For me, in watching like Black women rappers get more attention. And if you kind of watch the trajectory of a lot of their careers, I mean, we can trace, I'll go back. There's a lot more like popular examples that are presently, I think, more interesting. But like, just if we look at Cardi B for an example, like really briefly, like, and we think about the trajectory of her career and like how she utilizes very intentionally digital moments of virality in order to spark interest in her career, like very early on, right? So we think about like her placement on reality television, but we also think about her very intentional use of platforms like Instagram, right? Like the way that she tells and captures, right, these moments of her story, how she strategically releases, tidbits about her life, and it's not like this really like moment of, oh, I'm going to release this moment of my song, right? Like I'm an artist, and so I'm going to give this. No, I'm going to like curse out like the person around the corner on Instagram Live. Like it's these kind of viral moments that build this like interest or intrigue about the humanity of the Black woman artist versus simply focusing on the music content and like the consideration that takes, like the understanding of digital platforms, of brand marketing that it takes to actually engage in that, like regardless of what your music sounds like, that you're going to have an entire following of people before your album comes out, right? Because of how you have promoted yourself as a commodity, right? And so this is really important, not your music, but how you promoted yourself as a commodity. And so this is why I get to this place of like, it's fascinating. I'm happy they're getting their money, but also I'm really intrigued by the idea of the decision to make oneself the marketable tool within hip hop, right? Like not to make the music that, but to make it me, to make the image of me, the way that I sound when I'm not rapping, to make my life story that thing. And I think that there's a shift, right, that's happened. And I'm not a hip hop like scholar, so this is me just freewheeling, right? But like, this is what I've noticed with the hip hop girls, right? Like on TikTok, it's like, this is what we're doing, right? It's that like, we're creating a sense of image so that no matter what sound I put out, you are connected to me, the person, or the captured moment of myself that I presented to you. And so there's a lot of that that's been happening over the last few years. I think Cardi gives us a great like kind of roadmap of like, she gave a lot of girls like the secret, the sauce, right? Like how this is how you get to that place. And we're seeing that in repetition right now.
I guess I'm interested in Black women's digital intimacy, particularly on Twitter, but also on audio first apps like Somewhere Good. And so I'm wondering about you mentioned about how so much of the research or the thinking about this space is the talking back. And I totally agree with you. I'm more interested in terms of the conversations we're having between ourselves, particularly as us being hypervisible, but also invisibilized online. And so I guess I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about Black feminist technoculture and these enclave moments, particularly on Twitter, but not only through a lens of pleasure, but also like what I'm calling a carefulness in terms of how, some of my participants were talking about how they won't always call out another Black woman if they see waywardness on the timeline, for example.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the layered complexity that we're bringing to the kind of conversations about the nuances of Black discursive practice in those spaces. And this is no shade to anyone who's written about it in these ways. I think there've been some really brilliant texts that focus on things like hashtags and activism on Twitter. And I am deeply appreciative for that work. But I think the moment that signaled the shift for me was when I kind of just realized that we weren't hashtagging anymore. We weren't hashtagging like we used to. And not to say we don't still live tweet things. There's moments that are still apparently really useful for hashtagging in Black cultural practice online, but there's a lot fewer moments that are. And there seems to be a shift in making sure that certain conversations stay, quote, in-house. And that's to say they're still visible, right? It's still anyone might be able to have access. Some folks made their accounts private, but that didn't seem to be the full move. I think it was either people moved off of Twitter, which a lot of folks who were heavy on Twitter in 2009, 2010 era, just moved off the platform. It's just not what it was and they're done. But there is also this way that folks are engaging in these deeply private conversations publicly without sending out signals or flags about what they're talking about. And I love this, right? I love the I just wandered into a conversation, right? And somebody's like, I cannot believe she just did that. And I'm like, wait, what's the first tweet? What I meant, you got, right? And so as a researcher, what this tells me even more is that as we as researchers get more and more methods to scrape, to gather up tons of data at once, what the folks are doing requires something different. Right? It's requiring our presence. It's requiring our care. It's requiring our attentiveness to be there and to be present in moments to understand those conversations and to see them as fleeting, as most conversations are offline, right? So as folks become even more familiar with the idea that oh, what you do online is forever. Oh, none of this stuff is going away. And we're responsible for that, right? Researchers who are acting in ways that are outside of ethics, who are posting really deeply private moments or moments that might get folks harassed or doxxed in our research, right? When we're doing that, we're letting folks know this is not a safe space to do that organizing anymore. You need to move somewhere else because we're going to capture it for our own benefit, right? It doesn't matter what impact it has on you, what harms it might cause you. We're here for what we need to get our projects accomplished. And so we're complicit. And we have to think about that complicity in our work and how, even in writing this book, right? This book is going to help get me tenure, right? This book is going to get me promoted. This book is going to do these things. And books aren't profitable monetarily for academics, but they carry social capital. And so I have to think about the distance that I'm creating between myself and the folks I write about, even though I think of myself as being a part of these communities, right? That in the cachet that I get for having written the book, I'm creating the distance. Right? That creates the space and the gap that's necessary that if I'm not attentive, that I no longer am paying attention to how my work can cause harm, that how my talk can cause harm, that bringing up this person's very personal situation can cause harm, right? And so it takes more time, more care, more accountability that is baked into IRB processes or baked into a lot of the ethical guidance that we receive as humanists or social scientists.
Your last few responses have definitely fired up the chat. I see two of our Solidarity Fellows, Hallie Ashby and Kelsey Moore, having a conversation about Black women's entertainment presence. I don't know if either of you wanted to offer any comments by voice on that at all. You're making some great points.
I love this digital ride along. I want to talk to you more about this. This is great. I'm ready to cite that.
We also have Shanice Calhoun in the queue with a question. Shanice, you want to say yours out loud?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for this talk. And I really can't wait to finish the rest of this book because I read the end and I've had so many conversations with my friends about it. I think it was like, I remember like after reading like the first 2 pages, I was like removing all hats. Like this is gonna be a very deep and personal experience, and I am 1,000% here for the ride. So my question is about like the future of the digital space. So I was thinking about like Black feminist techno culture within like the tradition, and when I used to be a like a feminist archivist, going through the letters of Anna Julia Cooper and like seeing like, okay, who are you corresponding with at this specific time, and it's like when you read back, you almost see that like she intended for these to be read, what you say about like the capturing of like of moments, the capturing of the time, like she really does she does it like the job for it. And it really sets the tone for us. And so I was thinking about Black feminist technoculture within that tradition, and I was thinking about like what do you think like this generation is doing in order to see themselves in the future, and whether or not we're doing that now. And I think right now, as somebody who's Gen Z, all I see on the news is things relating to climate change. And a lot of Gen Z has like a kind of like a defeatist mentality when it comes to our futures, and which is why we take advantage of technology that we have in the present. But like, how could we, like insert ourselves in the future so that we can like almost combat this like defeatist mentality?
Yeah. So I love this question. I mean, so when I started this project, you're supposed to always have like in your mind what your next project is going to be, right? So I started this project and I was like, oh, my next project is I'm going to work with folks to like start archiving their own like digital stuff, right? Because there's like all these Black feminists who like their stuff is going away, and like we need a record of it. And so we need to start keeping track of it. We need to like hold this as a collection. And like, so here's where I land on that now. It's like, I don't know. Because it's tough, right? Like it's gray and it's complicated. It's all those things, right? So one, I wrote the book in part because what I watched happen, what I saw happening in Black feminist discourse in the academy was really problematic to me, because what Black women and girls were doing online was getting written off as unimportant and not serious. And I thought, well, what if folks said that about Hurston? Like, which, like, what if when folks were in Harlem, like doing this, like people weren't keeping track, like we wouldn't know the things. Are y'all serious? Like, this isn't serious to you. What? Because we stand Beyonce. Like, what is it about our actions that is so unserious to you? It's the memes. Is it the GIFs? Like, what is it that we're doing? And what I needed was to write a book that actually just talked about a moment, right? And not try to write the whole history of Black feminist thought and the whole future of it. But I was like, okay, what we got to do is talk about what's going on right now, because it's really specific to this moment. And we need to keep doing that. We need to keep documenting what's happening right now and making sure that in our trajectory of talking about Black feminist thought, that digitality doesn't become a way for those who are gatekeepers to say that this is unserious, it's untethered to seriousness, it is not useful, it is not something that should be preserved. And so that's where I landed with it, right? It's not my job to do the actual preservation through like gathering all of everyone else's documents and holding their space. Because what I often get asked too is like, oh, you created an archive for this, are you going to share? And the answer is no, right? Like no, I did a thing for a thing. And if folks want to, if they want my help, if I can be helpful to folks in holding their own work and holding their own documents and making them available, I would love to do that. But it's not mine to do. It's not my task to do in this case. But what I would say is that like we have to think about our task as community members, as scholars, as writers, as thinkers, as content creators, as being a part of documenting, right? That when we're making TikToks or when we're making blogs or when we're writing Medium posts, that we're a part of the process of actively documenting what is going on in Black feminist thought right now, what is happening in the ether. Like what you just said is really deeply critical, is that like the reason we're doing this thing is because we don't see a future. So we're acting this way in a present. Like, we need documentation that actually reflects that as the cultural moment right now. So when we're studying TikTok, we need to study it through the lens of the folks who are creating in that moment and why content creation becomes hyper important. So I started out by saying, like, we're not users anymore, we're content creators. I think you just told us what part of that shift looks like. Part of that shift is I have to tell my story now, because the world might not be here in 50 years for me to tell my story to folks. Right. And I didn't feel that pressure at 16. I didn't feel that pressure at 25. Right. That, like, if I don't get this out right now, this is it. And so feeling that amount of pressure is about telling the story right now as a researcher that takes into account what folks like you are telling me that Gen Z is feeling about the environment, is feeling about climate change, and how that actually is really deeply connected to the TikTok videos they're making. Right. That's serious stuff. That's not a joke. That's not something to write off, right? Is that, like, Gen Z is Gen Z is out there making jokes in the middle of this hurricane, right? And people are like, they can't take anything seriously, or they take it all very seriously, right? And so we have to joke because we take it super seriously. And this is what it means to look back in order to go forward, because Black folks have been saying this since forever. We take it all really seriously. And that's why we joke about it. Right? Like, that's where the jokes emerge from, is that your life is on the line every day. And so if you don't joke about it, then what do? You sit in fear, right? And so the most marginalized communities about us have been giving us these survival strategies for a very long time. If we choose to pay attention to them, mainstream society could probably learn quite a bit.
We have a queue that is open, but I do want to note that Hallie and Kelsey are chopping it up in the chat.
Right, I'm trying to keep up. I'm like, wait.
Going down. So I just want to open the floor again, just in case either of you want to bring it into the broader.
Like, no, we're good over here.
You're like, no, we're good.
We're good over here.
Kelsey, I do want to ask that question in the space, Kelsey.
I'm here. I just don't have my camera on. I'm sorry. I came in late, so I was unsure what has been discussed and what hasn't. But just the comment about Doja Cat and just other, like, viral moments around, like, Black women on Twitter, I always come back to the question of colorism, because I think that really shapes how people even will engage with certain kinds of Black women, especially on the internet space, because it's a highly visual, highly aesthetic driven kind of environment. And we know that, like, colorism, the darker you are, the more aggressive you're perceived, the less serious you are taken. So yeah, I just wanted to know how people's thoughts, It's
a good question. The first article I wrote in grad school was about colorism, but it was about colorism, like, in kids media. I wrote about Proud Family. And I was writing about how even in spaces that we create as, like, uplifting, like, Black spaces, right? Like, where we can illustrate whatever we want, where we're not, like, bound to actual, like, the physical look of actors. Like, we can create, we can be imaginative, we can be, we can fantasize. Even in those spaces, it's colorist, right? Like, if you watch back old episodes of Proud Family, those who are not familiar, it's this show that came out, oh man, it's probably like 15 years ago now, right? Like 15, 20 years ago. And they just did the revamp of it on Disney Plus recently. And it's this, like, this Black family, which I love Proud Family, by the way, like, just, like, full disclosure, my kids watch it and they're big fans as well. And, but there is deeply problematic colorist stuff going on in this show, right? Where we have, like, the darkest women on the show being called the Gross Sisters, where we have, like, the most sought after female characters either being Latinx, light-skinned Latinx women, right? Or being light-skinned Black women, right? Where we have, like, the socioeconomic status of the parents tied to their color as well, right? The whole of Oscar Proud's family being darker skinned and being treated in this, like, buffoon sense, whereas the mother's family being lighter skinned and being, like, thought of in, like, this, Jack and Jill type of a Blackness, right? And so this happens not simply online, right? Like, that we have this as built in as a part of our legacy that we have to deal with in every space where we have access to create and consume content. And I think what we see online is reflective of the society at large, right? Like, so there's not going to be a world in which we escape the problematics of our society through digital culture. That's what people were imagining at the start of writing about digital space, right? It's going to be this highly democratic space. Everybody's just going to be seen for who they are. Everyone can participate. Everyone can do the things and the yada yadas, right? And we know that that's not true. And so it's disingenuous for us to write about these spaces without attention to notions of things like colorism, of whose voices gets heard, right? And it's a disingenuous for us as researchers to not pay attention to whose voices get centralized in spaces. I think it's incumbent upon those of us who have proximate whiteness, right? And so I want to be really clear, because I've been seeing folks like float around like people are passing. That is a really specific term. But folks who have proximate whiteness, which means that like aesthetically and phenotypically, that our hair, our face, our eyes, our skin are proximately closer to whiteness than other Black folks, that we have to be particularly cautious of the rooms that we're invited into to give talks where other people aren't, of how our voices are prioritized in spaces when other folks aren't, and how we use that proximate whiteness to bring other folks into the conversation. It is incumbent upon us to do that work, right? And so there is solidarity in the fact that we can all be Black folks, but we can also talk about the differentiated experiences that we have on the basis of colorism without negating the fact that we're all Black folks who are experiencing Blackness in the US culturally, right? And ethnically. So it's a great question. I think it's one that we have to keep wrestling with as we keep wrestling with all of these issues that persist offline and are translated to online spaces.
Loving and not loving this. I remember turning Proud Family back on and I was like, oh, I'm uncomfortable.
Right? Right? I was like, wait, we're going to keep calling them the Gross Sisters in the 2022 version? Okay.
In the episode where they actually take it up and where they're like, yeah, like, you know, oh, like they go into the Gross Sisters history and it's a whole thing, but
they tried. They gave it a try. They gave it a good try. But it's the both and, right? Like there's a lot of our cultural products that are problematic, right? Because we're problematic. Like I'm problematic, right? Whoever your fave is, they're problematic too, right? Like that. This is something that we're gonna have to deal with in digital spaces, in talking about hip hop, in talking about digital culture, whatever. And I think what's really interesting about bringing it back to the text here for a moment about digital Black feminism is our faves from back in the day were problematic. Right? That we just didn't know all their business at the moment. But what digital culture requires of Black feminist writers right now is that alongside your public writing is your personal life. And so a lot of the Black women that I write about who were big in the blogosphere, who were writing for national magazines and things like that, ended up leaving Twitter, leaving other platforms, not because something that they wrote was a problem, not because their writing fell off, but because folks were digging deeper and deeper and deeper into their personal life, were attacking things that their fathers did or possibly could have done, associations that their mothers may have had, where their children went to school and and so we don't have, I would say, the luxury in some ways of dissociating our public person with our private person in this digital this whole public-private divide just isn't a thing. You can't say this is a public space and this is a private space. And so there's something that's happening that can be really amazing about interweaving and stitching and threading together our personal and our public lives. But there's also something that's really harmful to a lot of Black women about the extent to which we feel that we should be privy to their private lives, that they owe us more content. They owe us more of themselves. They can't keep those things to themselves, right? Like people will ask you some really deeply personal questions online. And I'm like, how do you possibly think that you are owed that answer from me? Like, how do you possibly think that you get to have access to that part of my being? But it's because this is the culture that we've created, right? That we've created a culture in which everybody's personal stuff is online all the time. So why isn't yours? Show us the kids. And I'm like, absolutely not. Absolutely not, Twitter. Like, absolutely not. I don't know you. Instagram, I know you, but I don't know you, Twitter. And so you don't get access to that part of you, right?
Sure. And I just want to shout out Ashley Wade, who's been doing amazing work on the different ways that Black girls use different platforms.
Yes.
thing somebody put in the chat, you know, thinking about different I think maybe it was Tatiana, different personalities and different platforms. Ashley Wade, who was, it's full disclosure, was in the Black Code volume of the Black Scholar, but is, since I believe she's at University of Michigan, maybe, is UVA, there we go.
Yes.
Is amazing work on Black girls using different platforms for themselves individually, but also being very, very aware of that choice, right? Of making that a conscious choice, and them theorizing what it means to present as Black girls, as themselves and their whole humanity. In space online. So I think that's incredibly, there's a lot here. Hallie, to the floor.
You finally pulled me out of the chat. Thank you, Dr. Knight-Steele. This has been really great. But what you just said made me think of the kind of collective surveillance practice that's coming online based on what people think they deserve to know about people. And I was just wondering if you could speak more to that. I've been thinking recently about, I think it's not just one person, but several Black women are getting contacted by their employers because people don't like what they say online and losing their jobs, but also the kind of policing that happens around what is problematic and what is not, what people call like cancel culture. I don't want to get too much into that because obviously that's not real, but when people start to kind of track your history of problematic things. So I was just wondering what you thought about this, a new kind of collective surveillance, often within our own community.
Yeah, internal collective surveillance, right? One thing I've seen, and okay, so I'll do the history piece, right? Because I'm good for that. Is that like when we saw the blogosphere, right? When we saw these spaces that were popping up in the early 2000s to like, you know, 2010-ish, whatever, you know, they didn't have big audiences, right? Like part of what was going on in the blogosphere was that like you were crafting this like really niche audience that came to find your work every day, and you couldn't find it through a search. There was no like algorithm that was sending me to these places. Like somebody I knew in real life had to tell me this blog existed and how to get to it, and I got there and I stayed there, right? And part of what was really lovely about that was the space that created to mess up and then get it right later. Like the space that it created for folks to like not be held to some unrealistic standard of what they should know or have access to at that stage, to like figure things out together. I always use VSBs as an example, and so I might as well today as well, like, because I think it's such an interesting example of a Black feminist site that's run by two men. And so VSB's Very Smart Brothers was a site that, you know, came about in like, I don't know, 2007, 2008, only stopped officially this year. But the two folks who started it, they create this space where they're very much figuring it out in the early days. They didn't start this as like, we are men who are starting a Black feminist blog. This is like a lifestyle and humor blog and a dating blog. So they were saying some stuff right, about their relationships with women. And it was, you know, if you were there from way back when, to what Panama and Damon are writing now, you watch their evolution, you watch their growth, and you hear them credit that to the Black women who were there, who like talked to them and taught them and brought them along for the ride. And they will say this, you know, upfront and easy, right? Like Damon wrote a piece called Black Men are the White Women, Black Men are the White Men of Black People. And he got a lot of hatred for them. It was like white cis men. I mean, it was like Black cis men or something like that. And so, oh my God, it was such a great article, right? But what Damon will always tell you about this is, I'm not the first person to say, like Black women have been trying to tell y'all for years the way that the patriarchy functions within Black communities, right? But I write it and it goes viral and all the news sites pick it up and everyone's paying attention to it and it becomes really important, right? But what he was able to do, what all of us who were there in those early days were able to do, was figure some stuff out quite quietly and collectively. And there was no culture of, I got you, I see what you said last week and I'm gonna repost it and nobody's ever gonna come back for you, right? But think about what the shift to content creation from user culture does for us, right? Because as we move from a space where we're users and consumers of this to where content creators ourselves, there's also a competitive requirement for how we interact online, right? Because in the need to post the most viral content, to actually get paid from our work, there's a zero-sum game involved. If you're watching my content, it means you're not watching their content. I'm making more money off of the clicks, right? And so there's a possibility that we begin to internalize a structure wherein our participation online is about capital. is about social capital and economic capital, that I need to have access to more likes, more views, more this, more that, right? In order to get that, that means you have to have less because there's only so much attention. Now, not quite true, but that is how we process attention, is as a zero-sum game. That's what advertisers will teach you as well, right? You're paying attention to my product or theirs. You can't do both. And so we've collectively created a culture wherein it's necessary for our own survival online to make sure other folks are not thriving online. And what I have started to watch happen with folks who started in the blogosphere way back when is they're pulling out of places like Twitter and TikTok and Instagram that function on this premise, and they're replicating of spaces that look more like the blogs they created before. So we see the emergence of Black podcasts, right, that actually are doing some of that work. We see the emergence of spaces like what Lovia J has created, which are like, people are doing newsletters again, right? Like I think Jamila Lemieux now has a newsletter again, right? And so we're actually circling back to some of the ways that we create enclaves, that we create protective spaces where people can again figure things out, where there can be collectivity and community. And I think that that's an interesting like cycling that happens. And I don't know that we stay there forever. I don't know what it looks like into the future, but I think it shows us kind of the ebb and flow of what this capitalistic society does to us and with us and how we respond to it. So I think that that's what we're seeing in the wave right now, right? I'm seeing a lot of Black folks who have experienced the full cycle of the wave, right? Being like, never mind to the content creation. This actually isn't what I want to do after all. Whereas I see a new wave of folks who are coming of age at the peak of it, who it's all that they've had access to. They've never seen a digital Black world that looks different than this one. And so it'll be really interesting to see what this wave of Gen Z content creators ends up with in 5 to 10 years after, quite frankly, capitalism sucks the life out, right? Like after it bleeds dry what it can, because that's what it's going to do. That's ultimately what it's there to do, right? Is to take all that is possible and leave nothing in its wake. And so we'll see. And I don't mean this to say that they won't live, they won't survive. I am curious to see what kind of creativity emerges after that experience. But I think that experience is going to come. It's going to happen.
I have a question that's about capture. You were talking about capture, chat was lighting up, everybody was very into it. Thinking in the terms of conversations around data and computational humanities that have been long going, that I think sort of intersect in some ways with where Black folks, both on the ground and in the academy are at with these topics, but are also, like as DH does, sort of separate, and aren't really thinking about Blackness or race or difference or systems of power or whatever else.
Right.
So you saying capture, immediately I was thinking of Joanna Drucker's, CAPTA, and thinking about data as CAPTA as something that data as a thing that you are capturing essentially, but not using CAPTA. And then Matthew Levin's, sort of challenge to that around thinking about situated data as better than CAPTA, in part, for particular reasons, but in part because CAPTA, is potentially derived and can elicit images of capture and of slave capture and everything like that. And then you talking about capture is very different, but also in some ways, also seems grounded in the like we're, fucking in the grays, and we're also, thinking about how, to live in this structure that we have inherited. And then lastly, it also was making me think of Rashad Newsom's exhibit, Capture, I believe, where he created the AI installation over at the it's not the Forum. Why am I was just writing about this. I'm blanking on where it was, but the Armory, at the Armory, and created an AI named being that is the embodiment of queer and trans and drag, on all the ways that those are intersecting. Vogue and New York, joy and pleasure and dance and the embodiment and dance of an engagement, all of it. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about capture and how we can think about, that in context of data, or Black beyond, big caps for the beyond data, and wherever you want to go with that.
Yeah. capture was such an aside in my first writing of the chapter where it emerges in the book. It was such like it was one of those, to go back to how I started this talk. Andy Rejected taught me better than this, and he would have been ashamed because I did not operationalize that term. I just used it like in a sentence in a talk when I was like working out some of the ideas from this like a couple of years ago. And there was a question from an audience member that was like very similar. It was like, can you talk more about your use of the term capture? Because I see you kind of say, and then he went on to like say some stuff that I had not thought of yet. And I did the thing that you do. And I was like, yes, exactly. That's precisely how I was thinking about that term. And then I went home and thought about it. And I thought a long time about it and sat with both the idea of how the folks who I was studying were connecting to and were developing a relationship with capture. So in chapter 4 of the book, I look at 3 Black women who are writing online in our present age, and 3 Black women who are writing at the turn of the century in some ways. And I make the case that instead of studying affordances of platforms, like what's built into the tools that we use, that it is perhaps more fruitful to study how we develop relationships with the affordances of the platform, because the affordances of the platform are ongoing and changing so frequently that if you write in depth on one platform right now, it's not going to be as useful to readers in 30 years as writing about how and why people developed the relationship that they did with that tool at that moment as what the tool could do, right? And so capture became this way of thinking about how folks developed this complex relationship with their varied tools. That like, how would they use a pen or a typewriter or, or Instagram, right? To engage in the act or the practice of capture. And how does that act of capture shift over time based on their desires, based on their wants, and based on what they have access to, right? So like Zora Neale Hurston's relationship with capture as it comes to the typewriter is fascinating to me, right? Like there's all these books written about how much she hated typing, right? Like, but yet was a typist, right? Like served as a typist in order to get money from her patron, right? Like did the thing that she hated doing because it signaled her as not serious and not an intellectual, because that's how she could get the money to do the serious and intellectual work she wanted to do. And so the relationship to capture in that case became really interesting, more than the product that she created through the capture, right? Like through the typing up of other people's work, through capturing other people's thoughts. The artifact was less significant than how the person formed the relationship with the tool. And so in each one of these cases that you bring up, I think it's so interesting, like in the same way our relationship with data, in how we capture data, I think the interest for me lies in the relationship that we form through that process. So like, what are we intending to do? How are we going about it? What's going on in the context around us that prompts us to do it without the judgment of like, is the artifact itself appropriate? Is it good? Is it bad? Does it do, right? The artifact is interesting, but like, I'm a communication scholar through and through, and I'm always interested in the praxis. I'm always interested in the activity of the doing, of the communicating, of the discourse, right? And how, yes, relationships get formed in those conversations, right? And so I point to Stephanie Dinkins' work at Stony Brook University, an artist there who does some really fascinating stuff with AI as well. It reminded me when you were describing that last project, right? That involved capture, right? Involved like capturing the voices of ancestors into AI. And so we can continue to have these conversations. And I first heard like that description and I was like, wait. And then I watched this project unfold, and the care that Stephanie brings to the voices and the recordings and the people who are interested in preserving them, and how she creates these relationships with AI, right? These relationships with the tool, and how she lets community, she gives space, I should say, for community to create relationship with tools. And so in each of these cases, I just continue to think about how capture gives us this moment to do what we were just talking about, right? Like to create pathways toward better, more ethical research, but also like reflects back on us the accountability that's necessary on our part because of the power of capture that we hold in our scholarship. It is just like never lost on me that like some of the folks I write about in this text aren't read in classrooms and should be, and yet my book is, right? That like they're not picking up Jamila Mu's writing, and y'all really should be, right? Like you really should be reading her in your Black feminist classes. Or that like Lovia J, who's like a humorist and blogger, you should be studying the way that these discursive practices have been deployed over time, right? Like that should be in somebody's textbook. But my book does get picked up. And so my capture of their words gets marked as more significant, more interesting, more important. And so all the way along the way, this idea of capture has just, you know, both betwixt and intrigued me. And I'm grateful for that person who asked that question then. And I'm grateful for learning how to fake it till you make it, because I got back and I did the work afterwards. But that was a great question. It really set me down a pathway with capture that I think is continuing to provoke new questions for me all the time.
Catherine, we are at time, but this has been such a pleasure. I hope folks got something out of it. Yeah, please let's have a round of applause, throw your emojis, everything. Thank you all so much for being here. Just as a reminder, this is the Black Beyond Data Reading Group. This was co-sponsored with the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, Communities Knowledge Lab, as well as the Disco Network, where Catherine Knight-Steele is a PI. We have our next reading group next month. Black Beyond Data is bringing Brandeis Marshall, who is a data scientist and founder of Data X Group, and she is also the author of Data Conscience, Algorithmic Siege on Our Humanity. She will be circulating some readings for us all to get into. Skylar will make sure that everybody gets into that. If you want to, you're already signed up, so you should get them. You don't have to sign up on that bit.ly link again, but if you want to share it, bit.ly/BBD reads, BBD and R capitalized. Last round of applause. Thank you guys so much for coming and for being here. See you guys next month, and have a great weekend. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you so
Knight.
much. Thank you. Hit me up on Twitter. I dropped my @ and BCaT's @ follow us. We're doing big things.
Yeah.